There are some battles in history so big they have the power to change the course of human history. But what if one side has elephants? Be ZULU'S versus the British is a clash of arms unlike any other. And this is the first part of our exclusive series, the British one, Bo. There's a lot more to this battle than meets the eye. And it's been called the greatest battle in the history of mankind. So we've re-gone. Explore just why that is, and what would have happened if things had gone differently. It's me. This is the last of the Mohicans. B also instituted the bullhorn formation, a crescent-shaped battle formation that could flank its opponent. Lastly, he trained his soldiers to fight, shoulder to shoulder in a rectangular formation known as the Buffalo Horns. But Chaka's greatness lay not only in his military genius, but also his understanding of politics and diplomacy. He forged alliances with neighboring chiefs, often through marriage, and ruthlessly crushed anyone who betrayed him. By the time he died in 1828, he had built the Zulu kingdom that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the mountains of Lesotho. On January 1879, a Zulu impi, or army, of between 10 and 20,000 warriors ambushed and slaughtered the entire Buffalo column except for a handful of survivors, and relieved them, resulting in one of the most spectacular British victories in South Africa. It's become something of a legend, immortalized in the film Rorke's Drift, starring Michael Caine. Their only hope for survival is that Lieutenant Colonel Bromhead can keep the Zulus at bay until reinforcements arrive. But the Zulu impi keeps coming. Wave after wave of Zulu warriors attack the thin line of British defenders. And while you're at it, why not drop us a like while you're down there? Bye. And if you want to see more from our incredible artists, follow them on social media. Links are in the description below. Perhaps the Zulus would have gone on to conquer all of South Africa. In this scenario, the Zulus would have continued to exist as a distinct people, but they would have lost their independence and become subject to British rule. They would have been forced to abandon their traditional way of life and adopt the British system of government, economy, and society. Join us next time when we'll pick up with the Battle of Rorke's Drift and find out what would have happened if the Zulus had won. See you then. And their leaders would have been replaced with British officials who would look after the interests of the colonial government. Despite this, the Zulus would have continued to play an important role in the defense of the British Empire. Many Zulus would have served in the colonial army, fighting in conflicts around the world, such as the Boer Wars and World War I. They would have been instrumental in helping the British maintain control over their vast colonial empire. And in a world where the British Empire never fell, this could have resulted in a complete reshaping of the global balance of power. Maybe the Zulus would have adopted modern weaponry and become a formidable fighting force, capable of standing toe-to-toe with the best that Europe had to offer. Maybe they would have become a superpower in their own right, ruling over a vast empire that stretched from the Cape of Good Hope to the Mediterranean Sea. The possibilities are really endless. Can Bromhead and his men hold out? Will the reinforcements arrive in time? Find out next week in Part 2. News of the disaster reached Chelmsford, and he ordered his column to continue northward to the mission station at Raucous Drift, where he believed the survivors from the Buffalo column might take refuge. A few years ago, I made a series of videos about King Leonidas and the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. But, like his father before him, Dingan proved to be a weak leader. How do you think Bromhead and his men are going to escape the impossible situation they've been placed in? Who knows? Maybe you think they should just kill everyone in the mission and take their land. Or maybe you're on the Zulu side. Maybe you're one of those crazy Zulu conspiracy theorists. Whatever the case, we can't wait to read your comments. So please, don't let us down. Instead, we're going to focus on what might have happened if the tide of the battle had turned. What if the Zulus had won? Let's find out. Tensions finally boiled over. In 1879, when British colonists demanded that the Zulus submit to British rule, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Dawson Chelms, better known as Lord Chelmsford. The column set off north from the city of Durban to the Zulu kingdom. When the Zulus refused, the British declared war. They would send columns to subdue them. The Zulus would come to know them as the Blood River Column and the Buffalo Column. He became increasingly paranoid and isolated himself from his advisors. Eventually, his half-brother, Impand, led a revolt, killing Dingan and ending the Zulu dynasty. The Buffalo Column set off from the town of Escort to meet up with the Blood River Column and force the Zulus into a decisive engagement. It was actually my very first series ever, and since then, the channel has grown to over 1 million subscribers. By their weapons and tactics were no match for the superior firepower of the British. At the time of the battle, they were the largest ethnic group in South Africa, speaking the Zulu language, part of the Nguni Bantu languages. They originated from the northern regions of what is today South Africa and migrated south during the 1700s, led by a man named Shaka Zulu. In the end, the British victory at Raucous Drift would go down as one of the most decisive victories in military history. His father was a weak leader and wasn't much liked by his people, and he wasn't much liked by Shaka either. The boy was reportedly beaten by his father at a young age for failing to fight back against a bully. It was the last straw for Shaka, and he ran away from home, joining a band of outlaws. There he learned to fight, hunt, and survive in the wild. He was eventually captured by the rival Ndwandwe clan, sold into slavery, and forced to work in a mine. But he eventually escaped and returned to his father's village as an adult, only to be rejected by his own family. Undeterred, Shaka went to live with another local chief who took him in and taught him warfare. Over time, Shaka grew the chief's army until he was strong enough to launch his own bid for power. He used guerrilla tactics to wear down his opponents and ultimately defeated his father's clan, absorbing them into his own. He did the same thing to the neighboring clans until he had united the various Nguni tribes under his banner. But the Zulu victory at Isandlwana was one of the most decisive defeats in British history. So I want to celebrate that milestone by returning to where it all began with a new series about an even more epic clash of arms. The Zulus versus the British. Now, if you know your history, you probably already know how this one ends. To get this out of the way right up front, the Zulus were a fierce and disciplined warrior culture. But before we get into the battle, we need to talk about the Zulus themselves. Shaka was born in 1787, the son of a chief, Senzangakona, and one of his many wives. The secret to Shaka's success was his army. How he developed new tactics and weaponized the throng Assegai. His successor, Dingan, kept up the good fight, defeating a coalition of Boers and British allies at the Battle of Gickley Hill in 1838. Throughout all this, the British colonial government saw the Zulu kingdom as a threat to their own power. The Blood River Column consisted of 4,000 troops, including 800 British soldiers, the rest being native African allies. Meanwhile, the Buffalo Column consisted of fewer than 1,500 men, mostly British soldiers, but also including a detachment of 250 native British troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Pule. But before they could do any of that, the Zulus struck first. Now, despite being outnumbered, the British garrison at Rorke's Drift was able to hold off the Zulu attack long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But we're not here to talk about that battle. The year is 1879, and the British are trapped in the mission station at Rorke's Drift. Make sure to the most, the British likely outcome is that the British would have simply annexed the Zulu kingdom and incorporated it into their colonial holding. Check out our international channels to watch our videos in other languages and hit that bell icon so you never miss a beat. Until then, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below with your thoughts on the battle so far. Also, it's likely that the entire Zulu nation would have been emboldened to rebel against their colonial oppressors. Pews. So what would happen if the Zulus had defeated the British at Rorke's Drift? We'll tell you right after. If the Zulus had managed to defeat the British at Rorke's Drift, the world would be a very different place today if the Zulus had managed to defeat the British at Rorke's Drift. But one thing is for sure. The Zulu nation has a population of over 12 million people. They are spread out across South Africa and many parts of the world. But do you know where it all started? If you've ever heard of Shaka Zulu, then you probably have an idea. But if not, then get ready for a history lesson from the 1800s in South Africa. But when Shaka was born, his father was already married to another woman and would take the infant back to his village, leaving Shaka to live with his mother. Created a military force, unlike any seen before in the region, while the other tribes only trained warriors for war, and let farmers and builders handle everything else. Shaka made everyone a part of the military. Farmers were taught how to fight, and warriors were given tasks like building and farming when they were UNT in the military. This meant that every single person in the Zulu kingdom was trained in multiple areas and could handle themselves in almost any situation. He went on to conquer even more land and power, spreading his empire further than any of his predecessors. But his time on Earth was running out. He would die in 1828, but his legacy would live on in the Zulu people long after he was gone. It was also mandatory for the men to live in barracks-style huts with their fellow soldiers, so that they could be prepared to leave on a moment's notice. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Just after Shaka's death, the British came back with an even larger force to punish the Zulus for what they had done at Is. They also tried to break the Zulu identity by forcing them to abandon their culture and way of life. But this didn't work. Ooh. The Zulu people kept their identity alive and eventually won back much of their land. Today, they number over 12 million people. And although they were defeated by the British Army, they still survived as a nation. There were 3 main battles between the British and the Zulus, but the Zulus lost all of them. Eventually, the British broke through the last line of defense at the Battle of Naisva. The Zulu king at the time, Setshwayo, realized that he couldn't win against the massive British army, so he surrendered. Shaka also encouraged his warriors to develop fighting formations that would allow them to move quickly and catch their enemies off guard. These tactics would be famously known as the buffalo horns and the bull horn formations. This made Shaka feel unwanted, and he developed a hatred for his father. This hatred would grow until Shaka became a warrior. The British Empire was growing quickly in this part of Africa and was not happy with the upstart Zulu king who refused to bend the knee to them. This was because Shaka had been supplying weapons and military aid to the smaller tribes that were resisting the British. Since the British were well aware of how powerful the Zulus had become, they decided to strike first. General Lord Chelmsford led an army of about 4,000 British troops, along with several thousand native allies into Zululand, to subdue the growing threat once and for all. To make matters worse, Shaka had taken the capital of the Dutch colony earlier in his reign and was occupying it. The British had set up camp here before moving on to the capital of Europe. Chelmsford left a portion of his army, including his artillery, to guard the camp, while he and the rest of the forces moved out. What he didn't realize was that he had walked right into Shaka's trap. The Zulu king had been waiting for this moment for years. Spies had watched the British as they moved through the countryside, letting him know where they were at all times. He had also known about the plan to attack him and chose to defend his home first before moving to the capital. As soon as Chelmsford's forces were out of sight, Shaka's warriors attacked. The British were caught completely off guard and were mowed down by the Zulu warriors. The British commander and most of his staff were killed in the battle, as well as nearly all of the artillery and supplies. Only a few hundred British soldiers survived the massacre. When the British heard of this, they sent an army to take it back. The Zulus, however, had other plans. And one day, during a hunting trip, he killed his own father. Some sources say he was defending his mother's honor, while others say it was just a power grab. Regardless, Shaka controlled the clan and would go on to become the founder of the Zulu Empire. During this time, there were various small Zulu tribes that were ruled by the larger, powerful neighbors around them. The Zulu people had been pushed into the mountainous and forest regions of what is today known as Natal. He was part of a group called the the Escuri, which means the storm. They wanted all of the land for themselves and would stop at nothing to get it. Dingaswayo was defeated by the Mafekan and lost his life in the skirmish. The Zulu kingdom was broken apart and would never be united again until the rise of another famous Zulu warrior. His name was Shaka. Here they lived under the rule of the powerful king Dingaswayo, who was also half Zulu and half He ruled with an iron fist and forced everyone in his empire to adopt the Zulu name. He also forced the adoption of the short, stabbing assegai instead of the longer, throwing spears that other tribes used. This change would later prove useful when the Zulus went into battle against the British. Dingiswayo kept expanding his empire until he was challenged by a neighboring king named Gaza. Shaka's father was Senzanga Kona, a chief who was a part of the Zulu clan. He began uniting the other small Zulu tribes and clans under his rule, slowly building up his army and making plans to conquer all of southern Africa. Shaka grew in power, so did his enemy. In 1879, the British colonial government in Cape Town received word that Shaka Zulu was preparing for war. The first battle took place near the town of Shaka was now the hero of the Zulu nation and was seen as a god among his people. Now, unfortunately for the Zulu people, there is no happy ending to this story. After winning the war, the British divided the Zulu kingdom into small pieces of land that were placed under the control of puppet leaders. Now, I want to hear from you. Did you know that the Zulu people almost defeated the British Empire? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. The Zulu Empire had reached the mission. Now, all that stood between them and the British camp was a small stream. The warriors could hear the shouting and the gunfire from the soldiers on the other side. Some of the men wanted to charge across the stream and give the British a piece of their mind. The Zulus were so much bigger and stronger than they were. There was no way they could win this battle. The Zulus reached the river and began to cross. The soldiers were exhausted, and they began to fall back. The Zulus followed close behind, ready to finish the job. Suddenly, the soldiers stopped and turned around. They had realized they were being attacked from two sides. We had no choice but to fight or die. The soldiers fought with everything they had, but it wasn't enough. The Zulus were too strong. The soldiers fell back, but it was too late. The Zulus were on top of them. The soldiers were surrounded. The soldiers on the hill opened fire, but it was too late. The British were defeated, and the Zulu kingdom was saved. The soldiers who had survived the massacre gathered around Durning. What now? One of them asked. Now we rebuild, Durning replied. We have shown the world that the Zulu nation is strong. No one will ever challenge us again. As the sun set over the horizon, the soldiers cheered. They had won their freedom. But as they celebrated, they didn't realize that the British were regrouping. The war was far from over. The Zulus were almost on top of them. The soldiers fell back, but there was nowhere to go. The Zulus were everywhere. The soldiers were trapped. But Sechweo knew that wasn't the way. He had to get to the top of the hill. Here, he drew his sword and rode out into the open. The Zulus saw him and stopped fighting. All eyes were on Durning. He raised his sword and shouted, "Stop! I have something to say." The Zulus' headman came forward and listened intently as Durning spoke. When Durning was finished, the headman nodded his head slowly. "I understand," he said. "Your people are very sick. You want us to help you." Durning nodded. "That is correct. We need your help. We are willing to give you anything you want if you will help us defeat the British." The headman looked at the carnage around him. "Why should we help you Your soldiers are killers. Before. They have murdered our people for no reason. Durning sighed. I know that, but we need your help. If you don't help us, the British will win, and then they will come after you. Pyre. They will kill you all, just like they killed the people in your village. The headman thought about this for a moment. How can we be sure that you will keep your word? Dunning smiled. You have my word as a gentleman that if you help us defeat the British, we will leave you alone. We will never bother you again. The headman nodded, slowly. Very well, he said. We will help you. From there, he could survey the situation and decide what to do next. As the Zulu continued to advance, more and more British soldiers began to fall. At this rate, they would be overwhelmed. Durning knew he had to act fast. He sent messengers to the rest of the regiments, ordering them to come to the mission as fast as they could. Then he took a deep breath and gave the order to attack. As the Zulu warriors charged across the open field towards the British, the soldiers on the hill panicked. They had never seen anything like this before. Durning watched as his men fought bravely but hopelessly against the Zulu warriors. It was a massacre. He knew it was time to end it, and so the Zulu warriors joined the fight. Together, the Zulus and the soldiers pushed the British back. The Zulu Impi had won a great victory. The British won the Battle of Blood River. But at what cost? The Zulus had lost more men than the British in the battle. Yet it was the British who paid the greater price. And today we're re-looking at what happened after the British defeated the Zulus at the Battle of Blood River. But remember, history is full of stories, and this story needs you to be a part of it. This had already weakened the kingdom before the war started. Before the Anglo-Zulu War, the Zulus numbered somewhere around 150,000 people. After the war and the subsequent smallpox epidemic, which ravaged the Zulu people, their numbers had dwindled to just 80,000. The British government even asked Queen Victoria to contribute to the war effort, and she agreed. She gave the British government £10,000. However, the value of that donation has eroded significantly since then. If we adjust for inflation, her donation would be worth around £1.1 million. So that shows you how much money the British needed to fight this war. If you want to learn more about the Anglo-Zulu War, check out the playlists in the card or the description. And remember, history is full of stories, and this story needs you to be a part of it. Thanks for watching. This represents a massive 47% decline in the Zulu population in just a few short years. As a result, the British government was forced to end the war as quickly as possible, and they succeeded in doing so. However, the defeat at Isandlwana changed all of that. News of the defeat spread like wildfire around the globe, and the British Empire was ridiculed by its colonial rivals. But what do you think? Did the British really pay the greater price? Or was it the Zulus? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. And while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. For example, the French were so shocked by the defeat that they published a satirical newspaper called The Tomb of the Empire. The Germans also mocked the British, and so did the Americans. Even the Zulus were mocking the British at the time. The Zulus had a song that they sang during the war, which went, Come and see the white men running away. In this way, the war tarnished the reputation of the British Empire, and they were never able to fully recover from it. But not without great cost to themselves and the Zulus. But arguably, the greatest cost to the British was the effect that the war had on their international reputation. Clearly, the Zulu nation was severely weakened by the war and its aftermath. But that was only part of the story, because the war bankrupted Britain as well. For example, the British colonial authorities had sided with Dinu, the half-brother of the Zulu king, Sechueo, when the two had fallen out over land disputes. Firstly, the war was incredibly expensive for the British. To put it into perspective, Britain had a national debt of £80 million at the start of the war. By the end of the war, that figure had increased to £250 million. Even worse, Britain was now paying around £3 million every single year to service that debt. To put that into context, at the time, the British Empire had a budget of around £9 million a year. So the interest on its debt was eating up around 33% of its annual budget. This situation was made even worse by the fact that the British Treasury had anticipated that the war would be a very quick affair. So they did not budget for the war to drag on for months and months. Consequently, the British government had to raise taxes on its people to pay for the war effort. By playing these factions against each other, the British ensured that the Zulu kingdom would be less able to resist the British takeover. Consequently, the Anglo-Zulu War would be the last war that the Zulus would fight as a united nation. The wars that followed would be fought by divided Zulu factions against the British, such as the rebellion led by the Zulu Prince in 1906. So if you like this kind of content, please subscribe and help out. So let's get straight into it. On January 1879, the British and the Zulus faced each other at the Battle of Izaba. And in one of the greatest military victories in African history, the Zulus overwhelmed the British, killing between 1,300 and 4,000 British soldiers. Let's unpack that statement. Firstly, let's have a look at the toll that the battle took on the Zulu nation. The Zulu kingdom came out of the battle very weak. It's true that only around 4,000 Zulus were killed at the battle, but that represented around 20% of the entire fighting force. That is a huge amount of any army to lose in a single engagement. But this figure does not even tell the full story, because the Zulu army at the time consisted of around 50,000 men. This meant that around 10% of the entire Zulu male population was killed at the battle. Not only that, but many thousands more were wounded, and an estimated 2,000 women and children were killed by marauding British soldiers following the battle. The British were utterly humiliated. They regrouped and launched a counterattack 3 weeks later, on February, at the Battle of Blood River, and there they smashed the Zulu army, killing around 4,000 Zulu warriors and severely wounding their king's head. The Zulus were defeated, and the British annexation of Zululand began shortly thereafter. Yet, despite the fact that the Zulus lost more men in the battle than the British, it was the British who paid the greater price. The Zulu king, Sechueo, was forced to flee, and he was captured and exiled by the British colonial authorities. He spent 7 years in exile before he was allowed back to his homeland. When he returned, he found that his kingdom had been completely The British had annexed all of the Zulu lands and divided them up into small reserves for the Zulu people, scattering them across Zulu. In essence, the British destroyed the territorial integrity of the Zulu kingdom. Furthermore, the Zulu kingdom was also weakened by the divisions created by the British between the various factions and families within the kingdom. In the years leading up to the Anglo-Zulu War, the British had supported one faction against the other in their internal power struggles. The effects of the Anglo-Zulu War can be seen in the demographics of the Zulu people to this day. In fact, the war actually had a greater impact on Britain than it did on the Zulus. But even that proved insufficient to cover the costs. So the British government resorted to borrowing money from wealthy individuals in order to finance the war. Furthermore, the British public was outraged by the cost of the war and demanded that the government take action to bring it to an end. Prior to the Anglo-Zulu War, the British Empire was seen around the world as invincible. And so we can conclude that the British really did pay the greater price despite being victorious.